Have you ever had the feeling that no matter where you go, something inside you stays slightly out of place? Not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, persistently, like a background sensation you can never fully shake off. You can be sitting among friends, having conversations, laughing at the right moments, doing everything that is expected of you. And yet, deep down, there is this strange awareness. I don't really belong here. Maybe you felt this your entire life. As a child already, sensing that you were different, without being able to explain how or why. Maybe you learned early on how to adapt, how to blend in, how to read the room and adjust yourself accordingly. You became good at it. So good, in fact, that from the outside no one would ever suspect that you feel like an outsider. But inside, the feeling never truly disappeared. You might have tried to solve it in all the logical ways, by changing environments, by seeking the right people, by thinking that maybe once you find the right relationship, the right job, the right place to live, this feeling will finally go away. And for a while, it sometimes does. Temporarily. But sooner or later, it returns. The same quiet sense of not being anchored anywhere. According to Carl Jung, this experience is not accidental. And it is not a personality flaw. Jung observed that people who feel like they don't belong anywhere often suffer not because they are incapable of connection, but because they are over-adapted to a world that does not reflect their inner nature. They live outwardly, but their soul lives elsewhere. From early childhood, we are taught, subtly and explicitly, that belonging equals safety, belonging to a family system, belonging to a social group, belonging to a culture, a role, a way of life. We learn very quickly what is rewarded and what is not, what makes us lovable, what makes us acceptable. And for many people, this adaptation happens so seamlessly that they never question it. They feel at home in the collective world. But for some, something resists, even when they comply, even when they do everything right. There is an inner friction, a sense that life is being lived slightly off-center, that the version of yourself that moves through the world is not the one that truly lives inside you. And this creates a subtle but chronic form of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of not being met at your depth. You may recognize this in the feeling that conversations stay on the surface, that you long for something more meaningful, more real, but don't know how to reach it, or in the sense that you are always observing life rather than fully participating in it, as if you are standing just one step outside of existence, looking in. Jung would say that this is often the result of a deep split between the inner world and the outer life, a split that forms when a person learns very early that their natural way of being does not quite fit into the structures around them. Instead of being mirrored and met, they adapt. They develop sensitivity, intuition, awareness, but also self-doubt. They learn to question themselves rather than the environment. Over time, this creates a peculiar paradox. You may be highly empathetic, deeply perceptive, emotionally intelligent, and yet feel fundamentally disconnected. Not because you lack the ability to belong, but because you have never been invited to belong as you truly are. The belonging that was offered always came at the cost of self-abandonment, even if that cost was subtle. And so the question slowly forms inside you, often without words. Where do I fit? Or perhaps more painfully, is there a place where I truly belong at all? This question is not a sign of weakness. it is not a symptom of immaturity or failure. In Jungian psychology, it often marks the beginning of a deeper psychological movement, one that does not lead outward, but inward. A movement away from borrowed identities and collective expectations and towards something far more unsettling and far more authentic. Because sometimes the feeling that you don't belong anywhere is not telling you that you are lost. It is telling you that the place you are looking for cannot be found on the outside. According to Carl Jung, one of the most underestimated causes of feeling like you don't belong anywhere is the development of the persona. The persona is the social face we learn to wear in order to function, to be accepted, to survive within the collective. It is not false in itself. Everyone has one. But it becomes problematic when it replaces the living core of who you are. For many people, the persona grows organically in dialogue with their inner nature. But for others, especially those who are sensitive, intuitive, or inwardly complex, the persona forms as a kind of protection. Very early on, they sense that their natural reactions, emotions, or ways of perceiving the world are not fully welcomed. So they adapt, quietly, intelligently, often unconsciously. They learn how to read others, how to anticipate expectations, how to adjust their tone, their presence, their needs. Over time, this adaptation becomes second nature. They are praised for being mature, understanding, easygoing, thoughtful. And yet, something essential is missing. Because what is being rewarded is not authenticity, but compliance. This is where the subtle tragedy begins. The more you refine your persona, the more distant you become from your inner center. You may function well. You may even succeed. But inwardly, a quiet estrangement grows. You no longer know where you end and where the expectations of others begin. And because belonging has always required adaptation, belonging never feels safe. This is why many people who feel like they don't belong anywhere are actually extremely capable of fitting in. They can enter almost any environment and adjust. But adjustment is not the same as belonging. Belonging requires resonance. It requires being seen without performance. And when your life is organized around a persona, resonance becomes rare. Over time, this creates a peculiar inner tension. On the one hand, you crave connection, intimacy, being met. On the other hand, being truly seen feels threatening, because you have learned that visibility comes with the risk of rejection. So you hover in between, present, but not fully there, connected, but not rooted. Jung noticed that this inner split often produces a diffuse sense of homelessness. Not homelessness in the literal sense, but psychological homelessness. You don't feel at home in groups, but you also don't feel at home alone. You long for depth, but depth feels isolating. You long for simplicity, but simplicity feels dishonest. And so you remain suspended, belonging nowhere fully. This is not because you are incapable of belonging. It is because the version of you that belongs is not the version that lives. The persona belongs. The adapted self belongs. But the soul remains unrooted. Many people try to resolve this by further refining the persona, by becoming even more likable, more competent, more understanding, or by searching endlessly for the right environment where they will finally feel at home. But Jung would say that as long as the relationship to the inner world remains fractured, no outer place can offer true belonging. Because the deepest sense of belonging does not come from similarity, but from alignment. And alignment cannot happen when your life is organized around who you think you should be. At some point, often during a crisis, a burnout, a loss, or a period of stagnation, the persona begins to crack. What once worked no longer does. The roles feel empty, the effort feels heavy, and the feeling of not belonging intensifies. This can be frightening because the structures that once gave you orientation are dissolving, but psychologically this is often a necessary breakdown. Jung believed that the collapse of the persona is not a failure, but an initiation. It forces you to turn inward, to ask questions you may have avoided your entire life. Who am I beneath adaptation? What do I actually feel? What do I need when no one is watching? This is where many people panic and try to restore the old identity. They return to familiar roles, familiar patterns, familiar expectations. But the feeling does not disappear. Because once the psyche has begun to move toward wholeness, it cannot be convinced to go back to a partial life. The sense of not belonging anywhere is often the psyche's way of withdrawing its energy from a false center. It is not pushing you away from life. It is pulling you toward a deeper one. And yet, this stage can feel profoundly lonely, because you no longer feel at home in the collective, but you have not yet learned how to inhabit yourself. This is the threshold, and crossing it requires something most of us were never taught: the courage to live without borrowed identities. There is a phase many people enter without realizing what is happening to them. A phase where the old ways of belonging no longer work, but nothing new has taken their place yet. Jung described this as a liminal state, a psychological threshold where identity loosens, certainty dissolves, and orientation is temporarily lost. From the outside, it may look like stagnation. From the inside, it feels like exile. This is often when the feeling of not belonging anywhere becomes strongest. You no longer feel at home in the life you used to live. The conversations feel hollow. The routines feel mechanical. Even relationships that once felt safe now feel strangely distant. And yet, there is nowhere else to go. No new identity ready to step into. No clear direction. Just an uncomfortable in-between. According to Carl Jung, this stage is not a mistake. It is an essential passage in the process of individuation, the movement toward becoming a whole and integrated person. But this process does not begin with clarity. It begins with disorientation. The psyche withdraws its energy from external identifications in order to redirect it inward. This inward turn can feel deeply unsettling, especially in a culture that values certainty, productivity, and visible progress. When you are in a liminal state, you may feel like you are falling behind in life, like everyone else is moving forward while you are stuck. But psychologically speaking, you are not standing still. You are descending. And descent is not regression. It is preparation. Many people at this stage report a growing sense of inner distance from the world. They may feel more sensitive, more easily overwhelmed, more tired by social interaction. Not because they are weak, but because their psyche is no longer willing to spend energy on what feels inauthentic. The outer world loses its grip, but the inner world has not yet revealed its structure. This is where loneliness takes on a new quality. It is no longer just the absence of others. It is the absence of orientation. You may ask yourself, who am I becoming? Where am I going? Why does everything feel unfamiliar? And perhaps the most painful question of all, will I ever feel at home again? Jung believed that this phase often coincides with moments of crisis, not necessarily dramatic ones, but subtle existential ones. A sense of meaninglessness, a loss of motivation, a feeling that life is happening around you rather than through you. These experiences are often pathologized or rushed through. But Jung would say that they deserve to be listened to, because the psyche does not withdraw its energy without reason. It does so when the old forms can no longer carry the emerging self. The feeling of not belonging anywhere is often the signal that the old containers of identity have become too narrow. You are outgrowing them. But growth is not experienced as expansion at first. It is experienced as contraction, as uncertainty, as a stripping away. The familiar reference points dissolve, and the ego resists. It wants answers, timelines, reassurance. But individuation does not follow a linear path. It unfolds symbolically, organically, often in darkness. This is why many people try to escape this phase. They distract themselves. They rush into new roles, new relationships, new projects, anything to avoid the void. But the void persists, because what is being asked of you is not replacement, but presence. To stay, to listen, to tolerate not knowing who you are for a while. Jung understood this as a necessary sacrifice, the sacrifice of the old identity, the sacrifice of borrowed belonging, the sacrifice of the image you once relied on to feel safe. This sacrifice is rarely conscious. It is felt as loss, as grief, as confusion. But without it, the deeper self cannot emerge. The irony is that the more you try to force belonging during this phase, the more alienated you may feel, because true belonging cannot be rebuilt on the foundations that have already collapsed. It must arise from a new center, and that center has not yet been fully formed. So you remain in between, no longer who you were, not yet who you will be, feeling like you don't belong anywhere because you are no longer meant to belong to what you have outgrown. This is not a punishment. It is a summons, and it is asking you for something very specific, not to find a place, but to become one. At some point in this process, something subtle begins to shift, not on the surface of your life, but underneath it. You may still feel out of place. You may still feel different. But the question slowly changes. It moves from, "Where do I belong?" to something quieter and more intimate. What does it mean to belong to myself? According to Carl Jung, most people are taught to anchor their sense of belonging outside themselves, in approval, in roles, in relationships, in being needed, chosen, recognized. And as long as this works, it feels natural. But when the psyche begins to individuate, these external anchors lose their power. They no longer provide stability. What once felt grounding now feels hollow. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening to them. They assume they are becoming more isolated, more detached, more disconnected. But psychologically speaking, something else is unfolding. The psyche is withdrawing its dependence on outer confirmation in order to establish an inner ground. And this is an unfamiliar experience because most of us were never taught how to live from the inside out. Internal belonging does not feel dramatic. It does not arrive as a sudden sense of certainty or confidence. At first, it feels fragile, almost shy. It begins as the ability to stay with yourself without immediately trying to escape discomfort. To notice what you feel without rushing to explain it away. To listen to your inner responses even when they don't align with what is expected of you. This is why the transition from external to internal belonging often feels like loss before it feels like gain. You lose the immediate reassurance of fitting in. You lose the familiar reference points. You may even lose certain relationships, or at least the way those relationships functioned. And in that loss, the old feeling of not belonging can intensify one last time. But something important is happening beneath that pain. You are no longer abandoning yourself in order to belong. You are learning to remain inwardly present, even when you feel misunderstood, even when you feel different, even when there is no clear mirror in the outside world. And this is a profound psychological reorientation. Jung believed that a person becomes whole not by eliminating difference, but by integrating it. Not by dissolving into the collective, but by standing in conscious relationship to it. When you begin to belong to yourself, you no longer need to erase parts of who you are in order to feel safe. You begin to carry your own center. This does not mean that the world suddenly feels like home. In fact, you may still feel out of sync with many aspects of society, but the difference is that this no longer feels like a personal failure. It feels like a truthful response. You stop asking the world to confirm your worth, and you stop asking yourself to shrink in order to be accepted. Belonging then becomes something quieter, but deeper. It shows up as integrity, as inner consistency, as the ability to move through different environments without losing yourself. You may still feel different, but you no longer feel fragmented. You may still be alone at times, but you are no longer abandoned. This is also the point where connection begins to change. Instead of trying to belong everywhere, you begin to resonate somewhere. You recognize people not by similarity, but by depth. Conversations may become fewer, but more real. Relationships may become more selective, but more nourishing. The irony is that true connection often becomes possible only after you stop chasing belonging. Because when you no longer need to be chosen, you can choose. When you no longer need to fit in, you can show up. And when you no longer betray yourself to be included, others can finally meet you as you are. This shift does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, often imperceptibly. You may not notice it until you look back and realize that the old ache has softened, that the desperate search for a place has been replaced by a quieter sense of inner orientation. You are still on the path, still becoming. But you are no longer nowhere. You are somewhere very specific now. You are with yourself. One of the hardest things to accept is that the feeling of not belonging anywhere is not something that needs to be cured. According to Carl Jung, individuation is not about arriving at a final sense of certainty or comfort. It is a lifelong movement, a dialogue between who you have been and who is slowly emerging. And because of that, the feeling of not belonging may return at different moments in your life, especially during transitions, endings, and inner shifts. What changes over time is not the feeling itself, but the way you relate to it. At first, it feels like a personal failure, like something is missing in you, like everyone else has received a manual for life that you somehow never got. But gradually, if you stay with the process instead of running from it, the meaning of the feeling begins to change. You start to recognize it as a signal rather than a verdict. You begin to see that this sense of not belonging often appears when an old identity has reached its limit, when the life you are living no longer reflects who you are becoming. when the psyche quietly asks you to let go of another layer that once kept you safe, but no longer feels true. In that sense, not belonging is not a sign that you are lost. It is a sign that you are no longer willing to betray yourself. This path is rarely easy. It often requires solitude, patience, and a willingness to walk without clear external validation. There may be moments of grief, moments of longing, moments where you wish you could simply blend in and stop feeling so different. But Jung believed that some people are not meant to fully dissolve into the collective. They are meant to stand slightly apart, not out of superiority, but out of fidelity to their inner life. Over time, something subtle but important begins to stabilize. You may still feel different, but you no longer feel fragmented. You may still feel out of sync with certain aspects of the world, but you stop interpreting that as a defect. You learn to carry your difference instead of fighting it. And in doing so, you begin to develop an inner sense of home that does not depend on circumstances, approval, or constant reassurance. Belonging then takes on a quieter form. It is no longer about fitting into every space, but about staying aligned with yourself wherever you are. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. You stop forcing connections that require you to disappear. And when connection does happen, it feels more real, more grounded, more mutual. You may still walk through life with a sense of otherness. You may still notice that you feel deeply, question deeply, perceive layers others move past. But instead of asking why you are like this, you begin to ask how you can live responsibly with this sensitivity, this depth, this awareness. And that question changes everything. If you have felt like you don't belong anywhere for as long as you can remember, know this: you are not behind, you are not broken, and you are not failing at life. You are responding to an inner movement that asks for honesty rather than conformity, for presence rather than performance, for depth rather than ease. This path does not shout. It does not rush. It unfolds slowly, often invisibly. And if you are on it, even in doubt, even in loneliness, you are already in the process of becoming more whole. If this reflection resonated with you, and if you feel drawn to exploring the inner world through depth psychology and the work of Carl Jung, you're very welcome to subscribe to this channel. Would you like to continue this journey together?